So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Ross, and I'm with the No Place Left Network here in San Antonio. And this morning, we're going to be talking about the phases of movement. So this is throughout history, all movements have gone through these phases. And so this is just a picture or helping us understand perhaps where we're at in our context and also what we're trusting God for when we talk about trusting God for movements. And so I'm going to introduce the first phase, which is really phase 0 to 1. And this is what's known as seed sowing. Seed sowing. And here, let's say that, so we've got John Williams here and Sean Sullivan in the room. Let's say that John and Sean want to go and they want to start a movement. They want to see the gospel of God reaching. We're going to say, just for the context of simplicity this morning, for simplicity's sake, we're saying you're going to an unreached people group. You're going to be going to a people where there is not a church, there's not even believers. What's the first thing that John and Sean need to do? Pray. Okay, good. And then after you guys pray, you are going to share the gospel. That's right. So, and are you going to share it just a few people? Or how are you going to share it? Yeah, broadly. You want to sow broadly. We're going to share the gospel with anybody and everybody, right? And as you share the gospel, people are going to start to respond, and we're going to start to see that people are going to come to faith. There's going to be believers. So these crosses on here, if you can see this on there are going to represent believers. And so then as these friends come to faith in Christ, right, one aspect that's really key in this 0 to 1 phase is in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter lays out or just reaffirms the priesthood of the believer. So the priesthood of the believer is super important in this early phase of movement, right? Who's able to share the gospel? Who's able to lead someone to Christ? Who's able to baptize? There's not pastors. There's not churches. So it's these new believers, right? And so we're empowering them. And then as these believers begin to emerge, something's going to start to happen. We're going to start to see that there's going to be a need for church. So I'm going to draw a little building here. We're going to see that churches begin to form. Now, who's going to lead these churches, John and Sean? Who is it going to be? You guys as the outsiders coming in?
Probably initially.
Initially, yeah.
There, and then hopefully we'll see new believers raised up that can lead those.
Yep.
Especially if I'm the outsider too. You mentioned this is geared at unreached peoples. I'm always going to be the outsider if I come into, so I need to raise up people that are insiders.
Exactly. So John just shared, in case you couldn't hear that on the mic there, that initially John and Sean are going to be leading, but they very quickly, right, like Paul and Barnabas in Acts, right, we see very quickly they want to empower the local leaders, the indigenous people, because who's best equipped to know how to reach this context and these people? The locals are, right? The local leader, the indigenous leaders. And so again, they're continuing to share the gospel. And as they begin to share the gospel and begin to see churches planted, we're going to move into the next phase of movement, which we're just going to call movement. Or another way to describe this really is, this is where multiplication begins to happen. Because now, it's not so much as they're sharing the gospel and as people are coming to faith, it's not John and Sean that are the ones that are causing this movement to begin to spread and rapidly multiply. It's these believers and these churches that are forming here. And as they're forming, we're also going to see that some of these, we're going to call them apostolic leaders, those who have the ability to go into a new context and begin to reach and to start new churches and see new people come to faith in Christ. Some of these apostolic types are going to begin to form from the indigenous people groups. And as they are raised up, they are going to begin to continue to plant new churches and new movements. And we're going to see that these churches are going to begin to multiply. They're going to begin to start planting other churches. And so, and as this happens, we're moving into this multiplication phase. And again, really key here is the priesthood of the believer. Again, and these churches, are they going to be really complex? Are they going to have, really, really amazing worship and sound systems and everything else? Yeah, probably not. Again, remember, this is an unchurched context. And so these might be house churches. Maybe they just meet in a coffee shop. Very simple churches that are beginning to really trust God for being able to reach their context. And so, but as we move into this, we're going to see that some pastors are going to begin to raise up, because we're getting into this next phase of movement. In the next phase of movement, now the multiplication is happening and spreading, but there's also a lot of believers they're hungering for depth. They're hungering for growth. And so this next phase of movement is what's known as formalization. Formalization. So the movement's beginning to take shape. It's beginning to have definition. And what's really key here is long-term discipleship. Hopefully this is coming through on the board there on the screen. But these friends are continuing to sow the gospel. Perhaps it's happening a little bit less in the streets or with these believers and more in the churches, right? People are inviting their friends to church, that kind of thing, but they're still sharing the gospel. The priesthood of the believer is still held up. We still have apostle types who are emerging that want to go and reach new contexts and reach new places. But as we get into this phase of movement, this formalization phase, what we're going to notice is that some of these pastor teachers, we're going to call PTs, some of those friends are going to begin to emerge, and they're going to be very gifted, and God's going to use them. And there's going to be this it's a natural desire. There's going to be a natural desire for people to come together and to hear in bigger groups, to worship, and to hear these pastor teachers. And so these call them rock star pastor teachers, the John Pipers, the Matt Chandlers, right? They begin to emerge, and what they're going to do, and again, this is a natural phase of movements, is they begin to plant or build bigger churches, bigger buildings. And again, that's not bad. That's not necessarily bad. It just is part of what happens. And so as we have gifted teachers, they plant these larger churches. And the question is now, where is the power, the shift of sharing the gospel beginning to take place to? Is it in the harvest? Yeah, no, it's moving back towards, it's moving towards the church, right? Because I have a friend who's a pastor who can teach really well the gospel. And so I'm going to bring my neighbor to hear them share the gospel. And so again, this transition begins to take place here. And then as we move over into the fourth and the final phase of movements here, this is what's known as institutionalization. Did I spell that right? Institution. That's a big word. Institutionalization. And here, and this is a great visual for us to see, especially in our U.S. context. Here the focus really is going to become a lot more on doctrine development. And so some of these pastor teachers and leaders who are very gifted, who are giving us great theology, they're going to get together, and what are they going to start? Yeah, they're going to start seminaries. So there's going to be these seminaries that emerge, and we've got larger churches where there's great teaching and great worship and great fellowship. And perhaps we still have some of the smaller churches as well in here. But one of the things you're going to notice, two things are going to begin to be less of a focus or less important in this phase over here. One we just talked about, the priesthood of the believer. That's really key and crucial in phase 0, in the 0 to 1, in the early phases, the seed sowing and movement. Super important here as well in the multiplication phase. But over here, again, the pathway for leadership development becomes this, you grab leaders out of the church, send them to seminary. And again, not bad, it's just different. The other thing that begins to disappear a little bit more in focus in this final phase of movement, doctrinal development, is the apostolic leaders. They've either all gone back, right? They are here and they're going back to a new context to start new movements, or perhaps they're minimalized. They're not known. Their gift isn't recognized within the church, and maybe they're sitting there and they're listening to amazing teaching and they're thinking, man, God, there's got to be more. There's got to be more. Is there something else? And so a couple final thoughts on this phases of movement. So some of our leaders within the No Place Left network and across the world, they would say the sweet spot of these movements is right here. In between this multiplication phase and in this formalization long-term discipleship phase. Because right here, we've got the priesthood of the believer. We've got the apostolic leaders. And one key strategy they're finding that's really important, especially in India and these other contexts and cultures, is that it's what's called a hot coal strategy. So you want to find these apostolic leaders who are right here, before that, before they are kind of lost over here, who understand and are close enough to this movement and multiplication, seeing this happen. You want to grab them out of this context. You want to send them back so that they can start here, perhaps in a new context, and be able to see this multiplication happen faster. And so that's the idea, is the idea of can we take a hot coal out of this sweet spot here in between the multiplication and the long-term discipleship process and send them back. So just a final few more thoughts before we turn to some discussion. And we should have some really good discussion on this, because especially in our U.S. context, one of the big questions is, where are we at in these phases of movement, and then what does it look like to actually return to, in some of our contexts, this 0 to 1 seed sowing, so we are reaching far from God friends. But one thought is that, over here in this institutionalized or doctrinal development stage, this is still the bride of Christ, that this is God's church. And so one thing that could emerge out of this teaching is that we could say, let's go back and, let's throw stones at pastors and Christian leaders who are over these churches that are maybe blocking some of these apostolic leaders of the priesthood of the believer. And the thing we want to say really loudly is not at all. This is the bride of Christ. We don't want to throw stones at her. In fact, one of the leaders on one of the other videos for this teaching was sharing that, in this context, we want to be as wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves as we go to these leaders. And we really want to communicate this, because the other aspect of this is that the language, or even just the practicality of how do you go from this to this, is a whole other language. How would you even do that? How do you go out into the harvest, and how do you actually share and talk about Jesus, other than just, hey, come to church with me and hear my pastor preach the gospel? And so the language there isn't there right now. So how do we do that? How do we talk about that? And then a couple other thoughts that are really key with this too, is that when it comes to this idea of movement, this was really huge for me, is in thinking about this, is that, one of the questions that comes up is, well, this is the phases of movements. All movements go through these phases. Why start a movement? What's the point? It's just going to go into this institutional and then eventual declining phase, right? Well, what we're trusting God for is not a movement, but what we're really asking God to do is to start movements of movements. This would be a movement that maybe as it hits that institutionalized phase, it's launching 6 to 10 new movements that are going out and beginning to reach new unreached people groups and new communities. Two other thoughts in closing is that one of the questions that we'll discuss here that comes up is, how do you talk about with leaders and existing churches these concepts and these ideas? And one of the things that's really been crucial has not been just talking about it, not just going and drawing out the 4 fields diagram and drawing out, the 3 circles or whatever else, but actually going into the harvest. Yeah, it's just, they're finding that it's just so much faster to just say to a pastor or leader, hey, let's just go and knock on a few doors and see what God does. Let's see if people are spiritually opened, and then for that pastor or leader to go out and see that these people are spiritually open, but perhaps they're not looking to come to a church, to come to an existing church. They're not excited about waking up every Sunday morning and coming to your church. And so just not talking about it, but showing people these phases of movement. And then key to all of this is leadership development. That we have to understand leadership development and the process of developing leaders. And we need to grow, and hopefully that's part of what we're getting together here on Thursday mornings to do, is to understand better leadership development so we can accelerate that. How can we accelerate leadership development to have more leaders going back to new contexts in our city, in the cities, and in the nations, to accelerate these movements, the growth of these movements being launched? Because ultimately our goal is no place left. We want to see all nations reached, not just our city or not just our neighborhood. We want to see all the nations reached. And if we're going to get there, we're going to need a movement of movements going out into the nations. So let me go ahead and end the video here, and then we're going to go ahead and we'll turn to some discussion on this, and we'll keep the video on.